The afternoon wind kicked up clouds of red dust as the stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Copperjack Saloon. Grace Edison stepped down, her blue traveling dress already coated in a fine layer of Arizona dirt. As she reached for her hat, a delicate piece of Eastern fashion that the desert wind immediately claimed. Sending it tumbling toward a patch of prickly pear, she heard the chaos before she saw it. A young calf, trailing a frayed rope, burst from between two buildings and charged straight into the dusty courtyard. From horseback, a lean figure swung down in one fluid motion. Thomas McKinley grabbed the rope, his boots sliding in the dirt as he fought to control the spooked animal. In his effort to corral the calf, he caught his spur on something Grace's prop trunk, sending it flying open. Face powder exploded in a pale cloud. Ostrich feathers drifted like snow, and colorful handbills announcing the Eastern Nightingale scattered across Main Street. Laughter erupted from the saloon's porch. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, part embarrassment, part anger. She grabbed a broken fan and executed a theatrical curtsy, trying to salvage some dignity from the disaster. Meanwhile, Thomas knelt in the dust, gathering scattered items with careful hands, his voice dry as desert wind. "My apologies, miss. The cattle here don't distinguish between audience and performers." At the public well later that afternoon, Grace struggled with the pump handle. The mechanism stuck, refusing to yield water no matter how she pulled. Thomas appeared beside her, placing a calloused hand over hers on the handle. "Allow me," he said. Not quite meeting her eyes, they worked the pump together, pushing and pulling in rhythm until water finally gushed forth, soaking them both. What had started as an awkward moment transformed into something almost comical, two adults standing there dripping in the desert heat. That first evening, Grace took the small stage at the Copperjack. She sang a folk ballad, her voice cutting through the smoke and whiskey fumes. The oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the rough walls. Thomas sat at the back of the room, still as stone among the restless crowd of miners and drifters. Through the haze, she caught sight of his eyes gray-blue like winter sky, cold and distant. After the final song, Jack Whitman, the saloon's proprietor, cornered Grace near the bar. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he suggested she mingle with the paying customers, especially the drunk ones with heavy pockets. Before she could respond, Thomas materialized between them. He didn't draw his weapon or raise his voice. He simply stood there, solid and immovable, until the gold prospector stumbled away, muttering curses. They found themselves at Senora Rodriguez's cafe, sharing a late meal of corn stew and black coffee. Grace talked about the long journey west, the theaters she'd left behind. Thomas spoke little, but his questions cut straight to the heart. "Did you choose to come here, or were you forced to?" Grace stirred her coffee, considering, "I chose to stay until I have enough money to choose to leave." Back in the cramped dressing room behind the stage, Grace unpacked her trunk and discovered something that made her laugh out loud, a broken comb with strands of calf hair tangled in its teeth. Outside her window, the desert night sprawled endlessly. Stars scattered like spilled silver across black velvet. The wind carried scents of sage and rust, the perfume of a land both beautiful and merciless. Red Butte revealed itself in the morning light wooden storefronts with peeling paint, a small church with a crooked steeple, the blacksmith's forge already ringing with hammer blows. The general store run by James and Margaret Campbell displayed goods behind dusty windows. A Chinese cookhouse advertised noodles made with alkaline water. Beyond the main street, Yaqui shelters clustered near the dry creek bed, a patchwork quilt of cultures sewn together by necessity and survival. The drought had lasted 3 months. Sandstorms buried porches and whistled through every gap in the walls. Nights bit with cold while days burned like furnace fire. Clouds scraped across the red mesas like wounds in the sky. Thomas slept in the livery stable, preferring the company of his aging mare, Cinder to most humans. Grace rented a room above the fabric shop. where wind played percussion on the tin roof through the long nights. She established her rules early. No drinking with customers. No following anyone to their rooms. Her smile remained professional, a performer's tool. Thomas had his own rules: stay out of other people's troubles, especially troubles belonging to women who knew how to smile through pain. Whisper drifted through town about the San Dimas silver mine needing order under Sheriff Clay Hargreaves' protection. Miners pooled money for burial funds as shaft accidents increased. The mine's eastern owners had sent for Pinkerton agents the shadow of industrial justice stretching long across the desert. Character revealed itself in small moments. Thomas used words like precious water, doing first and explaining later if at all. Grace possessed quick wit and deep endurance, transforming insults into comedy. Though darkness still crept in when the lamps burned low, both carried wounds that wouldn't heal, invisible scars that ached worse than any desert storm. Sunday morning found Grace teaching letters to the blacksmith's young son. Thomas stood outside, fixing a squeaky door hinge. The child's eyes moved between the stars painted on the saloon's ceiling and the quiet man who rarely smiled, both equally mysterious to young minds. Market day brought a swirl of commerce: Navajo traders exchanging leather goods for cornmeal, Mexican farmers selling peppers and squash. Grace bought a tattered cloth doll from a vendor, then spent an hour mending it for a Yaqui girl who watched from behind her mother's skirts. Thomas maintained his post at the cafe, a steady presence that discouraged the worst behavior from those who'd started drinking before noon. They learned to exist in the same harsh landscape, two planets orbiting the same unforgiving sun. When dust storms stole Grace's voice, Thomas boiled sage leaves and brought her the tea, ordering her not to perform. She ignored him, of course, but adapted speaking her songs instead of singing them, forcing the rowdy crowd to lean in and listen. It was the first time she'd seen Thomas truly smile. During water negotiations between neighboring ranches, Thomas drew boundaries in the dirt, creating a rotation schedule for the weak spring. Grace wrote out receipts for both parties to sign frontier justice drawn in dust and ink. The bathhouse behind the hotel had a temperamental boiler. One evening, Grace found herself trapped when the door swelled shut in the steam. Her calls for help brought Thomas, who freed the latch with practiced ease. Both flushed red from steam and embarrassment, but laughter dissolved the awkwardness. They understood boundaries and respected them, even as those boundaries began to shift like sand dunes in wind. On a moonless night, wolves howled at the desert's edge. Grace shivered despite the warmth. Thomas left a small knife by her door with a note: "Keep under your pillow for peace of mind." "What if I accidentally stab you?" she joked when she thanked him the next day. "Then I'll know you still want to live," he'd replied, and something in his eyes said he understood that particular struggle intimately. The supporting cast emerged from Red Butte's dust Senora Rodriguez with her fierce hospitality. Samuel Singh, the widowed mine worker who sent half his wages back to family in Punjab. The Campbells drowning in debt but maintaining their dignity. Each carried their own burden: poverty, grief, fear, hope. Red Butte became more than a town. It transformed into a community portrait painted in shades of struggle and survival. Something unnamed grew between Thomas and Grace, revealed in small gestures: a coat he left on the stair rail when night winds turned bitter, a page of Whitman's poetry she tucked into his tobacco pouch. No rushing, no promises, just warmth kindling in the desert's heart. The red dust settled on everything: clothes, skin, dreams. But sometimes, in the space between sunset and darkness, when the sky burned orange and purple over the mesas, Red Butte felt less like a trap and more like a choice. Grace would stand on the saloon's back porch, watching Thomas work with the horses, and wonder if choosing to stay might mean something different than being unable to leave. Thomas McKinley had been born to a Missouri schoolteacher and a blacksmith who believed in honest work and quiet faith. At 18, he joined the cavalry, drawn by promises of adventure and purpose. The army taught him to read the desert like scripture every hidden spring, every shadow that might conceal danger. He learned to track by disturbed stones, to find water by watching birds, to survive on hardtack and determination. But the winter of '89 changed everything. Leading a patrol through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, Thomas had misread the signs of an incoming blizzard. The storm struck with biblical fury, whiting out the world. When it passed, 2 of his men lay frozen in the snow, their faces peaceful as sleeping children. Thomas had held them as they died, helpless against the cold that stole their breath. The guilt froze something inside him deeper than any winter storm. He'd left the army with an honorable discharge and a wound no doctor could heal. For 12 winters since, he'd ridden alone, speaking more to horses than humans, as if words might somehow disturb the ghosts that traveled with him. Grace Edison's story began in a Boston brownstone, where proper young ladies learned to sing hymns and recite poetry. Her voice had been her rebellion too strong for parlor songs, too wild for church choirs. She'd found her place in theater, where passion was currency and emotion was art. But theaters were kingdoms ruled by powerful men. When she'd refused the advances of Benjamin Harrison, a prominent producer, he'd spread rumors that painted her as a woman of questionable morals. The decent theaters closed their doors, desperate for work. She'd signed with a touring company managed by Nicholas Cromwell, whose promises proved as substantial as smoke. Each town they played grew smaller, rougher, until she found herself stranded in Red Butte when Cromwell disappeared with the receipts, leaving his performers to fend for themselves. Grace kept a small leather journal filled with Shakespeare's words and Whitman's verses, copying them by candlelight to remember who she'd been before the West began its slow erasure. "I contain multitudes," she'd whisper to herself on nights when the desert felt infinite and she felt infinitely small. Red Butte sprawled along the old stage road like a question mark written in wood and adobe. Main Street's buildings leaned against each other for support. The Mercantile, with its faded signs advertising goods that hadn't been in stock for months. The assay office, where dreams were weighed and usually found wanting. The blacksmith shop ringing with the rhythm of survival. Florence Nightingale ran a boarding house with iron rules and thin walls. Lee Way operated a noodle house where miners could fill their bellies for 2 bits. His alkaline noodles a mystery that sustained half the town. At the desert's edge, the Yaqui people maintained their seasonal camp, trading herbs and handicrafts, their presence predating any map or claim. The drought had baked the land to pottery hardness. Dust devils danced down Main Street like drunken spirits. The seasonal creek had been dry so long that children used its bed as a playground, their games raising clouds that turned the sunset red as blood. At night, the temperature plummeted, and ice formed on water buckets while scorpions sought warmth in boots and bedrolls. The sky pressed down like a weight, clouds scraping across the mesas but never breaking into rain. Thomas made his bed in the livery stable's hayloft, preferring the honest smell of horses to the perfumed lies of saloons. His mare, Cinder, was 17 years old, gray as her name suggested, with wise eyes and patient ways. He'd talk to her while brushing her coat, confessing thoughts he'd never speak to humans. Grace rented a narrow room above Morrison's Fabric and Notions, where bolts of cloth gathered dust and the tin roof sang a violent song when the wind rose. She'd lie awake listening to that metallic symphony, wondering if she'd ever sleep soundly again. Grace established her boundaries with quiet steel. When miners got too familiar, she'd redirect their attention with a jest or a song, never letting them see how their crude words scraped against her dignity. She refused to drink with customers, knowing alcohol would blur the lines she'd drawn in sand. Thomas had his own walls, built brick by brick from guilt and isolation. He avoided entanglements, especially with women whose smiles could mean anything or nothing. Yet, something about Grace's determination, the way she held her chin high despite everything, kept drawing his attention like a compass needle finding north. Rumors about the San Dimas mine spread like infection. The Consolidated Silver Company had sent representatives from Chicago, men in dark suits who looked at the desert like a ledger to be balanced. They'd hired Clay Hargreave as sheriff, though everyone knew his badge was bought with company silver. The Pinkerton agents arrived on a Tuesday, setting up residence in the hotel. Their presence a reminder that law and justice were different currencies in the territories. Mining accidents increased with suspicious regularity. Cave-ins, bad air, equipment failures always in shafts where miners had been organizing, talking about wages and safety. The workers started a burial fund, passing the hat at the Copperjack every Saturday night. Rosa Rodriguez, who ran the cafe, kept the books, her handwriting precise as prayer. Character revealed itself in daily choices. Thomas moved through the world with an economy of motion, never using two words where one would suffice, never drawing his gun when his presence alone could diffuse a situation. He had a way of simply appearing when trouble brewed, solid and unshakable as the red rocks outside town. Grace possessed the performer's gift of transformation. She could make rough men laugh at their own crudeness, turn an insult into applause, maintain her dignity even when her stomach growled from hunger. But late at night, when the saloon finally emptied, she'd sit at the piano playing melodies that spoke of loneliness deeper than any desert canyon. The town's prejudices against a woman in her profession showed in small cruelties. The self-appointed moral guardians led by Constance Sherman, the banker's wife, would cross the street rather than share a sidewalk with Grace. Their children picked up the behavior, whispering behind hands. Grace responded by organizing informal lessons on the saloon's back porch during afternoon hours, teaching letters and numbers to any child who wanted to learn, using charcoal on planks when paper ran short. The confrontation with authority came gradually, like storm clouds building on the horizon. The San Dimas Company posted new regulations: no gatherings of more than 5 minors, no singing after 10 o'clock, no seditious talk about wages or conditions. Sheriff Hargreave made examples, arresting Edgar Poe, a shift foreman who'd questioned safety procedures, and Samuel Morse, who'd suggested workers deserved fair scales when their ore was weighed. Grace was summoned to the sheriff's office on a Thursday. Clay Hargreave sat behind his desk like a toad on a lily pad. His badge polished bright as his intentions were dark. He spoke of moral standards and community values, suggesting that a woman of her type might find other towns more welcoming. Grace listened with perfect stillness, then responded with a voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Sheriff, morality can't be measured by ticket sales or enforced with leather straps. If you'll excuse me, I have a performance to prepare." That night, the number 3 shaft at San Dimas collapsed. 3 men died in the darkness, their voices calling for help until the bad air stole their breath. The company blamed act of God, but Maria Rodriguez spoke truth over their coffee-cold bodies. God doesn't dig unsafe shafts or use rotten timbers. Sunday mornings in Red Butte carried a different quality of quiet. The saloons closed their doors, if not their back rooms, and families dressed in their least dusty clothes for church. Grace had started teaching on these mornings, using the cooler hours before the desert heat made thought impossible. William Franklin, the blacksmith's 8-year-old son, struggled with his letters, mixing up B and D with stubborn consistency. Thomas stood outside the makeshift classroom, ostensibly fixing a door hinge that had squeaked for months. The rhythmic scratch of his work provided a counterpoint to Grace's patient voice. B has its belly in front, like Mr. Morrison after Sunday dinner, she explained, making young William giggle. Through the window, Thomas watched her hands shape letters in the air, graceful as a dancer. The children watched with the focused attention usually reserved for fire or storms, this woman who sang in the saloon at night but spoke to them like they mattered in the morning. Market day transformed Main Street into a river of commerce and conversation. Navajo traders spread blankets displaying turquoise and silver work that caught the light like captured sky. Mexican farmers arranged peppers and corn in careful pyramids, the air filled with a dozen languages negotiating prices, arguing quality. sharing gossip. Grace moved through the crowd, her presence drawing looks both curious and hostile. At a blanket where cloth dolls lay in a pile, she stopped, picking up a sad figure with one button eye and stuffing leaking from its seams. "How much?" she asked in Spanish. The vendor, surprised by her fluency, named a price. Grace paid without haggling, then sat right there in the dust, pulling needle and thread from her pocket. A young Yaqui girl watched from behind her mother's skirts as Grace repaired the doll with careful stitches. When finished, she held it out to the child, who looked to her mother for permission before accepting the gift with solemn gratitude. Thomas maintained his post at Rosa's cafe, drinking coffee black as midnight while keeping watch. His presence alone prevented most trouble miners knew better than to start fights under his gray gaze. But he noticed Grace's small kindness with the doll, filed it away with other observations he pretended not to make. Tuesday brought dust storms that turned noon to twilight. The wind screamed through every gap, carrying sand fine as flour that found its way into food, beds, and lungs. Grace woke coughing, her throat raw, voice reduced to a whisper. Performance seemed impossible, but Jack Whitman had made clear that singers who didn't sing didn't eat. That evening, Thomas appeared at her door with a steaming cup. The liquid smelled of sage and something bitter. "Drink," he ordered. "Don't sing tonight." "I have to," she rasped. "Then don't." Simple. But nothing was simple in Red Butte. Grace took the stage that night and adapted. Instead of singing, she spoke her songs like stories, forcing the rowdy crowd to quiet down or miss the words. She turned limitation into intimacy, drawing her audience close with whispered tales of love and loss. Thomas, watching from his usual corner, smiled a rare crack in his stoic facade. Water was Red Butte's gold, more precious than any metal pulled from the earth. The nearest reliable source, a spring in the red rocks, barely produced enough for the town's needs. Ranchers from surrounding territories converged for water rights negotiations, their arguments growing heated as the drought stretched on. Thomas surprised everyone by stepping forward as mediator. Using a stick, he drew boundaries in the courthouse dust, creating a rotation schedule that gave each ranch access based on their stock needs. Grace volunteered to write up the agreement, her neat handwriting making the informal arrangement feel official. As ranchers signed their names or marks, she noticed Thomas watching her with something that might have been approval. The bathhouse behind the Cosmopolitan Hotel was Red Butte's attempt at civilization, fed by pipes from the town's water tower. It offered hot water twice a week when the boiler cooperated. Grace had saved for 2 weeks to afford a private bath, looking forward to washing away the persistent dust that turned everyone the same shade of desert red. The door, swollen from steam and age, stuck shut just as she finished dressing. Her calls for help echoed in the empty building until footsteps approached. Thomas's voice came through the wood. "Stand back." One solid shoulder against the frame freed the door. Grace emerged, face flushed from steam and embarrassment, hair still damp and curling. Thomas stepped aside quickly, but not before their eyes met. Something passed between them, awareness, possibility, fear before both looked away. They laughed, sudden and surprising, the sound bouncing off the bathhouse walls like escaped birds. "Thank you," Grace managed. "Doors here don't much care for staying proper," Thomas replied, and she wondered if he meant more than wood and hinges. On a night when the moon hid its face and wolves sang their hunger to the stars, Grace found herself unable to sleep. The darkness pressed against her window like a living thing, each sound settling wood. Scurrying mice, distant howls sent her heart racing. The next morning, a small package waited outside her door. A knife with a carved handle, wrapped in a piece of leather, with a note in Thomas's careful script, "Keep under your pillow for peace of mind." When she thanked him at the stable, she tried for lightness. "What if I accidentally stab you when you come to fix more doors?" His response carried weight. Then I'll know you still want to live." The words hung between them. Grace understood he knew about wanting to stop living, about nights when the darkness outside seemed preferable to the darkness within. She nodded, tucking the knife into her pocket where its weight felt like a promise not to use it, but to want to defend what life she'd built. Red Butte's supporting cast emerged in fuller detail as Grace and Thomas moved through their separate but intersecting days. Rosa Rodriguez ran her cafe with fierce pride, extending credit to miners between paydays, keeping careful accounts in a leather ledger. She'd lost her husband in a mine collapse 3 years back, but refused to leave. "His bones are in this earth," she'd say. "Where else would I go?" Samuel Singh worked the day shift at San Dimas, sending half his wages to family in India. He'd shown Grace a photograph once, a woman in a sari holding 2 children, their faces serious for the camera. "7 more years?" he'd said. "Then I bring them here." He practiced his English by reading Grace's Shakespeare aloud, his accent giving the familiar words new music. James and Margaret Campbell struggled to keep their general store afloat. Extended credit had put them in debt to their suppliers, but they couldn't bear to see families go hungry. Their own children, Theodore and young Mary, helped in the store, learning arithmetic by making change and human nature by watching their parents choose kindness over profit. Father Miguel ran the small Catholic church, though half his congregation couldn't afford tithes. He held services in Spanish and English, married couples for free, and buried the dead with equal dignity regardless of their accounts. Grace had seen him slip coins to widows, claiming they'd overpaid for candles. The Yaqui people maintained their seasonal camp near the dry creek, following patterns older than any map. They traded herbs and healing knowledge, wove baskets from desert plants, and watched the town's struggles with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. Their children sometimes joined Grace's lessons, quick to learn but careful to maintain distance. As weeks passed, patterns emerged. Grace and Thomas developed rhythms of interaction, coffee at Rosa's when their paths crossed, brief conversations about nothing that meant everything, shared silences that spoke volumes. Neither pushed toward the unnamed thing growing between them, content to let it develop like desert flowers that bloomed only when conditions were exactly right. The San Dimas Mining Company posted new regulations on a Monday morning, nailing them to posts along Main Street like declarations of war, by order of company security. The notices read, "Assemblies of more than 5 persons are prohibited. Public performances must conclude by 10 o'clock. Discussion of wages, working conditions, or company policies constitute sedition." Sheriff Clay Hargreave wasted no time enforcing the new rules. By noon, he'd arrested 2 miners for talking about shift schedules outside the assay office. The message was clear: San Dimas owned more than the mountain it claimed to own, the very air people breathed. Grace was summoned to the sheriff's office that Thursday. The room smelled of tobacco and sweat, decorated with wanted posters and a map of the territory marked with red pins. Hargreave sat behind his desk like a spider in its web, his badge catching the light from the window. "Miss Edison," he began, not offering her a seat, "we need to discuss the moral standards of our community." Grace remained standing, hands folded, expression neutral as she'd learned to keep it during difficult performances. "I wasn't aware morality was your jurisdiction, Sheriff." His smile was oil on water. "Everything's my jurisdiction when it affects the peace. A woman of your profession draws unwanted elements. Perhaps you'd be happier in Tombstone or Phoenix cities more suited to entertainment. I'm quite content here. Sheriff, my performances end before 10. I pay my rent on time and I break no laws. Laws change, Miss Edison. So do definitions of decent behavior." He leaned back, chair creaking. "The company is considering new ordinances about public entertainment. Wouldn't want you caught on the wrong side of progress." Grace met his gaze steadily. "Progress is an interesting word for what the company brings. Tell me, Sheriff, does progress usually require so many funerals?" His face darkened. "Careful, Miss Edison, that sounds dangerously close to sedition." I was merely observing. Sheriff, surely observation isn't illegal. Yet. She left with her spine straight and her hands shaking, hidden in the folds of her skirt. Outside. Thomas waited by the water trough, pretending to adjust Cinder's bridle. He fell into step beside her without speaking, his presence a silent declaration that she wasn't alone. That night, the mountain shuddered. The sound came first a rumble like distant thunder, followed by the mine whistle shrieking its alarm. Number 3 shaft had collapsed. Men poured from the other entrances, faces black with dust and fear, counting heads, calling names. 3 miners remained underground. George Washington Carver, a former slave who'd come west for freedom and found only different chains. Alexander Bell, a Scotsman who sent every cent home to his widowed mother. And young Frederick Douglass, Jr., barely 18, working to save enough for marriage. The rescue efforts lasted through the night. Men dug with bare hands when shovels broke. Women brought coffee and sandwiches, maintaining vigil at the mine entrance. Grace sang hymns to keep spirits up, her voice hoarse but steady. Thomas worked with the rescue crew, his knowledge of tunnels from Army days proving valuable. By dawn, they reached the trapped men. Too late. Bad air had claimed them hours before, their faces peaceful as if they'd simply fallen asleep. Mary Carver collapsed at her husband's body, her grief a sound that would echo in Red Butte's memory for years. Young Sarah Morse, who'd been planning her wedding to Frederick, stood frozen as understanding dawned. The company's response came swift and cold. Act of God, no liability. Miners work at their own risk. Rosa Rodriguez spoke truth at the graveside service. God doesn't dig unsafe shafts or use rotten timbers. God doesn't count profit over lives. A Pinkerton agent named William Reddick attended the funeral, standing at the back, making notes in a small book. He was new to Red Butte, with pale eyes that never seemed to blink and a way of appearing wherever miners gathered. His presence cast a shadow over the morning, a reminder that grief itself might be considered sedition. The town's prejudice against Grace intensified after she sang at the miner's funeral. Constance Sherman, the banker's wife, organized a committee for moral standards, circulating a petition to ban inappropriate women from teaching children. The document gathered signatures from those who feared the mine company more than they valued justice. Grace continued her Sunday lessons anyway. Though attendance dropped, young William Franklin still came, along with a handful of others whose parents valued education over reputation. She taught them from her Shakespeare collection, adapting the stories for young minds, showing them worlds beyond Red Butte's dusty borders. One afternoon, Reddick appeared at the saloon during Grace's rehearsal. He walked the perimeter of the room, making a show of examining the windows and exits, before approaching the stage. Miss Edison? Enjoying our town's hospitality. As much as anyone can enjoy a place where singing after 10 is considered criminal. His smile was winter cold. Clever women sometimes forget that cleverness has consequences. A woman alone, no family, no protection accidents happen in mining towns. Thomas materialized from the shadows near the bar. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, simply stood between Reddick and the stage. The Pinkerton agent measured him with those unblinking eyes, then touched his hat brim. Mr. McKinley, still playing guardian angel, careful wings burn easily in the desert. After Reddick left, Grace found her hands trembling. Thomas poured whiskey from Jack's private bottle, pushing the glass across the bar. "Drink," he ordered. "I don't drink with—" "You're not working. Drink." The whiskey burned, but less than the fear. "He threatened me." "Yes." "What do I do?" Thomas considered. "What you've been doing. Live, sing, teach. Don't let them make you small." He paused. "And maybe keep that knife closer than your pillow." The great dust storm struck the following week. It rolled across the desert like a biblical plague, a wall of red that devoured the horizon. Animals sensed it first, horses stamping, Dogs howling, birds fleeing. Then the humans saw it, a mountain of dust reaching toward heaven. People scrambled for shelter. Shutters slammed. Doors barred. Cracks stuffed with rags. The storm hit like a physical force, turning day to night. The wind screamed with voices of its own, rattling windows, tearing at roofs. Inside Rosa's cafe, where a dozen people had taken shelter, they could barely see across the room. In the chaos, young Charlie Dickens, the telegraph operator's son, got separated from his mother. Through the howling dust, Thomas heard the child's cries. Without hesitation, he plunged into the storm, navigating by instinct and prayer. He found the boy pressed against a wall, tears making mud tracks down his cheeks. Thomas wrapped the child in his coat and fought back to safety, arriving at the cafe looking like a ghost made of red earth. Grace was there with the others. She took Charlie from Thomas's arms, wiping the boy's face while his mother wept with relief. Then she turned to Thomas, brushing dust from a cut on his forehead with gentle fingers. "Heroic," she murmured. "Stupid," he corrected, but he didn't pull away from her touch. That night, after the storm passed and the town began digging out, Clay Hargreave announced new arrests. 5 minors were charged with conspiracy, the evidence being they'd been seen sharing a meal together. The Committee for Moral Standards posted their petition on the courthouse door, with Grace's name prominently featured as an undesirable influence. In Rosa's cafe, Grace stared at the document listing her supposed sins: performing in public, teaching without certification, residing without family supervision. The words blurred as exhaustion and defeat crashed over her. "I should leave," she said quietly. "They'll never stop." Rosa slammed a coffee pot on the counter. "You leave. They win. Next week they come for me, Mexican widow serving minors. Week after, the Changs for cooking foreign food. Where does it stop?" The argument erupted in the back room of Rosa's cafe, where flour sacks and coffee tins bore witness to the first real conflict between Thomas and Grace. She'd announced her plan to organize a benefit performance, proceeds going to the families of the dead miners. Thomas stood rigid against the doorframe, his opposition written in every line of his body. "You don't understand," he said, voice low and tight. "They'll come for you. Not with warrants or petitions with guns. They'll shoot out the lamps and claim it was an accident." Grace faced him across the small space, chin raised in defiance. "I understand fear perfectly well, Mr. McKinley. I also understand that silence kills more surely than bullets. Those families need food, not fear. Those families need you alive." "Do they? Or do they need anyone to stand up and say this is wrong?" She pressed her palms against the rough table. "I've been running from powerful men my whole life. I'm tired of making myself small. This isn't Boston. These aren't theater critics. Reddick and his men are counting on our fear." Grace's voice cracked with exhaustion and determination. "Don't you see, every day we stay quiet, they grow stronger. Every injustice we swallow makes the next one easier to force down our throats." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "You think I don't know that you think I sleep easy knowing?" He stopped, jaw working as he swallowed words. "Knowing what?" The silence stretched until Rosa bustled in, took one look at their faces, and retreated. Finally, Thomas spoke, each word careful as footsteps on thin ice. "Knowing that staying quiet makes me complicit, but losing you would be—" Again he stopped, turning toward the door. "Do what you want. You always do." He left before Grace could respond, the door closing with finality. She sank onto a sack of cornmeal, suddenly aware of how alone she was in this dusty back room, in this hostile town, in this vast desert that cared nothing for justice or love. That night, sleep eluded them both. Thomas lay in the stable loft, staring at the rafters while cinders shifted restlessly below. The wind carried memories not just of the blizzard that had claimed his men, but of all the times since when he'd chosen safety over righteousness. Each compromise had seemed small, necessary. but they'd accumulated like dust until he could barely recognize the man he'd meant to be. The ghosts of his frozen soldiers visited again, as they did whenever he faced a moral crossroads. Private John Adams, barely 19, who'd trusted Thomas to guide them through the storm. Corporal Benjamin Franklin Davies, who'd shared his last hardtack even as hypothermia stole his reason. They died because Thomas had misread the signs, chosen the wrong path. Now he faced another choice: protect Grace by stopping her, or protect her by standing beside her. In her room above the fabric shop, Grace sat at her small table writing by candlelight. Not a letter to send, she had no one to receive it but to herself, a practice she'd developed to clarify her thoughts. "Dear Grace," she wrote, "you came west to escape one kind of cage only to find another. The bars are different, made of dust and ignorance instead of rumor and propriety, but a cage nonetheless. If you stay silent now, your voice will die before your body does. You've already lost so much. Don't lose yourself." She set down the pen and picked up her Shakespeare. Opening to a passage she'd marked, "Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once." Easy words for a prince to speak, harder for a woman alone to live. 3 days later, Clay Hargreave made his move. Grace had finished her afternoon rehearsal when he entered the Copperjack with 2 Pinkerton agents flanking him. He carried an official-looking document, which he presented with theatrical flourish. "By order of the territorial governor, pending investigation of moral turpitude and incitement to disorder, you are hereby commanded to vacate Red Butte within 48 hours. Grace took the paper, scanning its legal language and official seals. Then, with deliberate calm, she tore it in half, then quarters, then eighths, letting the pieces flutter to the sawdust floor like snow. "I don't recognize the authority of documents purchased with blood money," she said clearly. Hargreave's face darkened to match his name. "You just destroyed legal documentation. That's a criminal act." "Then arrest me. Let's have a trial. I'm sure the territorial judge would be fascinated to hear about the San Dimas safety record." One of the Pinkerton agents stepped forward, but Hargreave held up a hand. He leaned close to Grace, breath sour with tobacco and whiskey. "You're going to regret this, woman, one way or another. You'll learn that this town belongs to those who pay for it." They left, but the threat lingered like smoke. Grace's hands shook as she gathered the torn paper, but she forced herself to finish cleaning the stage area before allowing the fear to take hold. Thomas arrived 20 minutes later, finding only ashes in the pot-belly stove and the acrid smell of burned paper. He read the story in Grace's rigid posture as she swept the same clean spot over and over. "They came," he said, not a question. "With deportation papers. I declined to comply." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a wall finally crumbling. "Then we'd better prepare for what comes next." The change in pronoun from you to we wasn't lost on Grace. She stopped sweeping, meeting his eyes. "Thomas?" "That night in the Sangre de Cristo," he interrupted, speaking faster than she'd ever heard him, as if the words had been damned too long. "Blizzard came from nowhere. I was supposed to read the signs the way the birds flew, how the horses acted. I was the scout. My job to keep them safe." His voice roughened. "John Adams from Ohio wanted to be a teacher. Benjamin Davies from Pennsylvania had a girl waiting. They trusted me, and I led them straight into that storm." Grace set aside the broom, moving closer but not touching. "What happened?" "Whiteout conditions. Couldn't see 5 feet. I found shelter, a cave barely big enough for one. Tried to go back for them, but the storm—" He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "Found them the next morning, frozen together. Benjamin had given John his coat. They died taking care of each other while I lived because I found shelter first. That's not... Every choice since then, I have chosen safe, chosen to look away, keep quiet, tend my own business, told myself it was wisdom." He dropped his hands, meeting her gaze with eyes full of old pain. "But it was cowardice. And if I let them hurt you because I'm afraid of making another wrong choice, that would be the worst choice of all." Grace did touch him then, just her hand on his arm. "We all carry ghosts, Thomas. The question is whether we let them guide us or bury us." He covered her hand with his. "What ghost do you carry?" She almost pulled away, but forced herself to answer. "Benjamin Harrison, theater producer, powerful man. When I refused his advances, he destroyed my reputation with lies. But the ghost that haunts me is my own silence." I smiled, stayed polite, tried to handle it quietly like a lady should. By the time I spoke up, no one believed me. Her jaw tightened. "I won't be silent again. Not for Hargreave. Not for anyone." They stood in the empty saloon, two damaged people recognizing their reflections in each other's scars. Outside, Red Butte went about its evening routines, merchants closing shops, miners heading to their shifts, children called home for supper. Normal life continuing while revolution gathered in the shadows. "So," Thomas said finally, "a benefit performance. To raise funds for the widows and orphans. They'll try to stop it. Then we'll have to be ready." He nodded slowly. "I know some men former cavalry, miners who've had enough. They could provide security. And I know women who can spread word, make sure people know the truth about why we're doing this." They began to plan, and in planning found a partnership neither had expected. As the evening deepened and stars emerged above the desert, something fundamental shifted between them. Not yet love, their wounds were too fresh for that, but the recognition of kindred spirits choosing to face the storm together this time. The meeting in the Morrison barn took place at midnight, lit by a single lantern that threw dancing shadows on the walls. They'd gathered in secret miners, shopkeepers, the priest, and others who'd had enough of San Dimas's stranglehold on their town. Grace stood before them, no longer the entertainer, but something harder, more determined. "We move tomorrow night," she said. "While they're watching the saloon for the benefit performance, a group will enter the mine offices through the old ventilation shafts." Samuel Singh spread a hand-drawn map on a hay bale. "These tunnels haven't been used since the original excavation. They're narrow, unstable, but they lead directly under the administration building." Thomas added, "We need evidence of their safety violations, the bribery, the real accident reports they've hidden. Without proof, we're just voices in the desert." Father Miguel blessed the endeavor in Latin, then added in English, "The cavalry regiment at Fort Buchanan has been notified. My cousin serves there, but they won't move without evidence of federal crimes." Rosa Rodriguez spoke up from her corner. "My nephew works in the telegraph office. He's seen messages between Hargreave and the company directors. They're scared of federal investigation. That's why they're pushing so hard now, trying to silence everyone before inspectors arrive." "Then we give the inspectors something they can't ignore," Grace said. She turned to the assembled group. "Everyone here has lost someone to the mine's greed. Tomorrow, we take back what they've stolen, not gold or silver, but truth." The plan was dangerous in its simplicity. While Grace performed at the Copperjack, drawing attention from Hargreave and his men, Thomas would lead a team through the abandoned shafts. They had one chance to gather evidence before the Pinkertons realized they'd been misdirected. The next night came too quickly. Grace applied her stage makeup with steady hands. Though her heart raced, she chose red bold, defiant, impossible to ignore. Thomas found her backstage, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "For luck," he said, unwrapping a small Derringer pistol. "It was my mother's. She carried it from Missouri to California and never fired it once." Grace took the weapon, surprisingly heavy for its size. "Let's hope I inherit her restraint." "Grace," he struggled for words, finally settling on, "don't be a hero. If things go wrong—" "I know. Same goes for you." She tucked the pistol into a special pocket sewn into her corset. "Though I notice heroes rarely take their own advice." They stood close in the narrow space, surrounded by costume racks and painted flats depicting worlds neither of them would see. Thomas raised a hand to her cheek, thumb brushing away a speck of powder. "After this is over," he began. "Tell me after," she interrupted. "We'll have time for words after." He nodded and was gone, leaving Grace to face her entrance. The saloon was packed, every table full. Hargreave sat front and center with 4 Pinkerton agents, making their presence obvious. Grace smiled as if delighted by the attention and took the stage. Meanwhile, Thomas led his team to the abandoned shaft entrance hidden behind a cluster of Joshua trees. The wooden frame had weathered to gray, and tumbleweeds choked the opening. They cleared it quietly, then one by one descended into darkness. The tunnel was worse than the map suggested. Ceiling beams had rotted, dropping in places to barely 4 feet. Water seepage had created pools of mineral-sharp mud that burned exposed skin. They crawled through spaces so tight that James Campbell, despite being the smallest, had to exhale to squeeze through. "Like being born again," Samuel Singh muttered, "except into hell." Above them, Grace sang louder than ever, her voice carrying through the saloon's thin walls. She performed every crowd favorite, stretched every song with theatrical pauses, anything to keep attention focused on her. When she ran out of familiar tunes, she improvised, turning nursery rhymes into torch songs that had the miners laughing and the Pinkertons scowling. In the tunnels, disaster struck. A support beam, weakened by years and water, cracked under their passage. The ceiling began to rain dirt and rocks. William Turner, a miner with 20 years' experience, read the signs instantly. "Move now. This whole section's coming down." They scrambled forward as the tunnel collapsed behind them, the roar drowning out their shouts. Dust filled the air, thick as flour, coating their lungs. When the rumbling stopped, they were trapped way back, blocked, only forward remaining. "Well," Thomas said, spitting grit. "No retreat now." They pressed on, following Samuel's memory of the tunnel system. The air grew thinner, making each breath a conscious effort. Finally, Thomas's hands found wooden planking the floor of the administration building. Using mining tools, they cut through, emerging into a storage room thick with dust and documents. Quickly, they dispersed Thomas to the main office, Samuel to the telegraph records, others to filing cabinets. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Ledgers showing safety equipment purchased but never distributed, the funds diverted to bribes, reports from inspectors marking shafts as extremely dangerous, filed away while work continued. Lists of miners marked as troublemakers, many now dead in accidents. A telegram from Chicago directors stating bluntly, "Acceptable losses, maintain production." "Mother of God," Father Miguel whispered, reading a report about children as young as 10 working in processing areas. They knew. They all knew. Above, Grace had exhausted her repertoire. The crowd grew restless. Hargreave stood, approaching the stage with deliberate menace. "Lovely performance, Miss Edison, but I think it's time for your finale." She smiled brilliantly. "But Sheriff, the night is young, and I haven't sung your favorite yet." "My favorite? The one about the corrupt lawman who gets his comeuppance? It's a classic tale, always brings down the house." His hand moved toward his gun. At that moment, a massive explosion rocked the building. Not the mine, the abandoned tunnel had finally collapsed completely, the compression forcing air up through other openings like a giant's cough. Dust erupted from floorboard cracks throughout the saloon. In the chaos, Grace spotted Thomas and the others emerging from behind the bar, covered in dirt but carrying armloads of documents. Reddick and his men rushed toward them, guns drawn. Grace didn't think. She pulled the derringer from her corset and fired into the ceiling. The small gun's report was sharp as a whip crack, and suddenly everyone was diving for cover. "Federal marshals are on their way," Rosa Rodriguez shouted from the doorway. "My nephew just received confirmation. Anybody who wants to explain dead bodies to federal law better think twice." Hargreave grabbed Grace. using her as a shield. Thomas froze, documents scattering from his arms. The saloon became a tableau, everyone poised for violence, waiting for someone to make the fatal move. Grace felt the cold barrel of Hargreaves' pistol against her temple. Time slowed. She could see Thomas measuring distances, calculating whether he could reach them before. "Can courage die before its flesh?" she said clearly, adapting Shakespeare to the moment. "Or does it live in every choice to stand?" She went limp, dropping like dead weight. Hargreave, expecting resistance, overbalanced. The derringer, still in her hand, found his foot. She squeezed the trigger. Hargreave screamed. Dropping his gun, Thomas moved like lightning, tackling the sheriff while others subdued the Pinkertons. It was over in seconds. No deaths, though Hargreave would limp for life. By dawn, Fort Buchanan's cavalry had arrived. They took custody of the evidence, the prisoners, and the mine offices. The federal captain, reviewing the documents, shook his head in disgust. "This goes all the way to Chicago, maybe Washington. You people have done a great service." As the sun painted the mountains crimson, Grace stood in the street she'd swept so many times. Her dress was ruined, her hair wild with dust, her voice nearly gone from the night's performance. Thomas stood beside her, equally battered. "You saved my life," she said hoarsely. "You saved your own life. I just helped with the cleanup." She laughed, then winced as her throat protested. "My hero?" "Though I notice heroes rarely take their own advice," he quoted back to her. They watched the Pinkertons being loaded into prison wagons, Hargreave cursing and threatening lawsuits. The mine stood silent for the first time in years, its machinery still as the company's authority evaporated. "What now?" Grace asked. Thomas looked at her, really looked, as if seeing past all the barriers they'd both built. "Now we help this town heal. Together. If you'll have me." "Is that your after this is over speech?" "The beginning of it." She took his hand, not caring who saw. "Then let's hear the rest." The morning after the confrontation dawned clear and strangely quiet. No mine whistles split the air. No machinery thundered from the mountain. Red Butte woke to a silence it hadn't known in years, as if the town itself was catching its breath. The funerals came first. With the mine temporarily closed and Hargreaves' reign ended, the town could properly mourn those lost to greed and neglect. They gathered at the small cemetery on the hill, where wooden crosses marked too many graves dated within the past year. Father Miguel spoke words of comfort in English and Spanish, while the desert wind carried the scent of sage and sorrow. Grace stood among the mourners, her voice too damaged from the previous night to sing. Instead, she read the names aloud, each one a person, not a statistic. John Washington Carver, beloved husband and father. Alexander Bell, son of Scotland, friend to all. Frederick Douglass, Jr., who dreamed of building a home. Her hoarse whisper somehow carried more weight than any song. Thomas watched her from across the gathering, noting how she touched each widow's hand, how she knelt to speak with orphaned children at their eye level. The morning sun caught the red in her dust-dulled hair, making it burn like banked coals. He'd seen her perform, seen her fight, but this quiet compassion revealed another facet of the woman who'd upended his solitary existence. After the service, Captain Andrew Jackson from Fort Buchanan addressed the crowd. "The Territorial Court has issued an injunction against San Dimas Mining Company. A full investigation is underway. Until it concludes, the mine is under federal supervision." "What about our jobs?" called out Samuel Singh. "We still need to eat." "The court has appointed a temporary administrator. The mine will reopen next week with new safety protocols. Any man willing to work under proper conditions will have employment." Relief rippled through the crowd. Justice was one thing, but empty bellies cared little for moral victories. That afternoon, the cavalry finished cataloging evidence from the mine offices. The scope of corruption staggered even cynical frontier soldiers. Bribes reached into territorial government. Safety violations dated back years. And the death count was deliberately obscured. This Hargreave fellow. Captain Jackson told Thomas. He's singing like a canary, trying to trade information for leniency. Claims he has documents hidden away that implicate bigger fish. Will it work? Maybe. Probably. Men like him usually find a way to soften their landing. The captain spat tobacco juice into the dust. But at least Red Butte is free of him. As the cavalry prepared to transport prisoners to Tucson for trial, Grace found herself appointed to an unexpected position. A delegation of townspeople, Rosa Rodriguez, the Campbells, Father Miguel, and others approached her at the saloon. "We need a teacher," Margaret Campbell said simply. "A real one. The children need learning, and you've already proven you can handle them." "I'm not certified." "Neither was anyone else who's tried." Rosa interrupted. "But you show up, you care, and you know things worth teaching. That's certification enough for us." Grace looked at their faces weathered, worn, but hopeful. "What about my evening performances?" "Keep them," James Campbell said. "Town needs entertainment too, but we can pay a small salary for teaching. Not much, but steady. And respectable," added Constance Sherman, surprising everyone with her presence. The banker's wife had led the moral crusade against Grace, but she stood with the delegation now. "I misjudged you, Miss Edison. Perhaps we all did. Red Butte needs people with courage. I'd be honored if you'd teach my daughters." Grace accepted with grace, though emotion thickened her already rough voice. Later, alone with Thomas at the stable, she finally let the tears fall. "A year ago, I was run out of Boston for being immoral," she whispered. "Now they want me to shape their children's minds." Thomas handed her his handkerchief. "People see truth eventually. Sometimes it just takes a mind collapse and federal intervention to open their eyes." She laughed through her tears. "When you put it that way, it sounds almost reasonable." Days passed in a blur of change. The mine reopened with Samuel Singh elected as shift supervisor. The miners trusted one of their own more than any outside appointee. Safety equipment that had been purchased but hidden finally reached workers' hands. Wages increased slightly, and more importantly, were paid on time and in full. Thomas found himself in an equally unexpected position. With Hargreave gone and no immediate replacement, the town needed law enforcement. A delegation approached him at Rosa's Cafe. "It's temporary," Mayor Theodore Roosevelt explained, "just until the territorial government sends a proper sheriff. But we need someone now, and the men respect you." Thomas stared at the tin star they offered. "I'm no lawman." "You kept peace without killing anyone," Father Miguel pointed out. "That makes you better than most who wear badges out here." He accepted reluctantly, pinning the star to his vest with hands that remembered too well the weight of responsibility. Grace watched from across the cafe, pride and worry warring in her expression. The transition wasn't smooth. Some of Hargreave's associates remained in town, stirring trouble where they could. Twice, Thomas faced down miners drunk on newfound freedom who wanted to settle old scores. He wore the badge but refused to become what Hargreave had been, a blunt instrument of control. "Law's about keeping peace," he told a group of would-be vigilantes. "Not keeping score. Anyone wants revenge. They'll deal with me first." Meanwhile, Grace transformed the old Wells Fargo building into a schoolhouse, with help from volunteers. They cleared out old freight, built benches, and painted a blackboard on one wall. She organized her curriculum around what she had: her volumes of Shakespeare and poetry, newspapers from the telegraph office, even mining manuals for mathematics lessons. The children came cautiously at first. Years of irregular schooling had left gaps wide as canyons. Grace met them where they were, teaching letters to teenagers who'd never learned, reading stories to young ones who'd never owned books. One evening, Thomas found her at the schoolhouse, head down on her desk. School papers surrounded her, marked with patient corrections. The lamplight caught the exhaustion in her features. "You're pushing too hard," he said quietly. She raised her head. There's so much they don't know, so much they deserve to learn. You can't fix years of neglect in weeks. I can try. He moved closer, sitting on one of the low benches built for children. Grace, you've already done more for this town than anyone had a right to expect. You don't have to prove anything else. I'm not proving, I'm building. She gestured at the papers. Each lesson, each small success, it's like laying foundation stones. Maybe I can't fix the past, but I can help shape what comes next. Thomas studied her face, seeing past exhaustion to the fierce hope beneath. All right, but you're taking tomorrow afternoon off. I have lessons. I'll teach them. She blinked. You? I can read, write, and cipher, even know some history from army days. Besides, he added with a rare smile, might do the children good to see their sheriff values education. The next afternoon, Grace watched from the doorway as Thomas awkwardly managed a classroom of curious children. He taught them to read animal tracks drawn in the dust, to calculate water needs for cattle, to understand the star's role in navigation. Not traditional lessons, but the children hung on every word. Mr. Thomas, young William Franklin asked, is it true you fought Indians? Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. I served in the cavalry. Yes, but fighting. Fighting's usually what happens when people stop trying to understand each other. The Apache and Yaqui know this land better than any map. We'd have done better to learn from them than fight them. It was a radical statement for a former soldier, but the children, especially little Maria Morales, whose grandmother was Yaqui, glowed at his words. That evening, Thomas and Grace walked along the dry creek bed. The sun painted the mountains purple and gold, and somewhere a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of borrowed songs. You were good with them, Grace said. They're good children, just needed someone to see it. She stopped walking, turning to face him. Like we needed someone to see us. The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Thomas reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The gesture, so simple, carried the weight of all the careful distances they'd maintained. Grace, I know, she interrupted. I know. We're both carrying too much past to rush toward any future. But Thomas, I'm glad we're walking the same direction. He took her hand, calloused fingers gentle around hers. For 12 winters, I rode alone, thought it was strength, but it was just fear dressed up as independence. And I performed alone, smiled alone, pretended that applause could fill the empty spaces. She squeezed his hand. Maybe we're both learning better. They stood in the gathering darkness, two damaged souls finding comfort in shared silence. The town spread below them, lamplights beginning to glow like earthbound stars. Red Butte had survived its trial by fire. Now came the harder task, building something worth saving from the ashes. The morning of their wedding dawned with unusual gentleness, as if the desert itself had declared a truce. No dust storms threatened the horizon, and a rare coolness lingered in the air. The small Catholic church, freshly whitewashed by volunteers, stood ready with simple decorations. White tablecloths borrowed from Rosa's cafe draped the altar, and wild flowers gathered from the creek bed filled mason jars along the aisle. Grace stood in the tiny vestry, wearing not white silk but her best blue dress, cleaned and pressed by the Chinese laundry. Margaret Campbell had sewn new lace at the collar and cuffs, while Constance Sherman, in complete reversal of her former antagonism, had contributed her own mother's pearl hairpins. You look beautiful, Rosa Rodriguez declared, adjusting Grace's hair one final time, like a woman who knows her own mind. I'm terrified, Grace admitted, her voice still carrying a slight rasp from that night of endless singing. Good, means it matters. At the stable, Thomas faced his own pre-wedding ritual. Samuel Singh and James Campbell had cornered him, determined to make the dusty sheriff presentable. His black suit, purchased years ago for military functions and rarely worn since, had been brushed clean of desert dust. Hold still, Samuel ordered, trimming Thomas's perpetually unruly hair. "You cannot meet your bride looking like you've been sleeping with horses." "I have been sleeping with horses," Thomas pointed out, "for years." "Not anymore," James said with a grin. "Rosa's nephew already moved your things to the house on Cottonwood Street. The Miners' Benevolent Fund took up a collection. It's not much, but it's yours free and clear." Thomas felt his throat tighten. After 12 years of solitude, the generosity of community still caught him off guard. The church filled quickly. Miners scrubbed clean of shaft dust. Merchants in their Sunday best. Yaqui families in traditional dress. Even some cavalry soldiers from Fort Buchanan who'd heard about the unlikely romance. Children lined up with candles. William Franklin among them, proud to be included in the ceremony. Father Miguel waited at the altar, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile. The organ, badly out of tune but played with enthusiasm by Lee Wei's daughter, wheezed out a processional march. Thomas stood at the altar, hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. When the doors opened and Grace appeared, the entire congregation seemed to inhale collectively. She walked alone, no father to give her away, no family to witness, but her bearing spoke of strength found in solitude and polished by trial. Their eyes met across the small church, and Thomas saw his own wonder reflected in her gaze. They had traveled such different roads to reach this moment, he through guilt and isolation, she through betrayal and perseverance, yet here they stood, choosing to write a new chapter together. Grace reached the altar, and Thomas took her hands. They were trembling slightly, and he squeezed gently, grounding them both. Father Miguel began the ceremony in his accented English, but Thomas heard little beyond the rush of blood in his ears and Grace's quiet breathing. Then came the moment for vows, and suddenly every word mattered. "Grace Edison," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of all his unspoken years. "I've been riding alone for 12 winters, through storms and drought, always moving, never stopping long enough to let anyone matter. You changed that. You showed me that courage isn't about facing danger alone. It's about standing still long enough to let someone stand beside you." He paused, swallowing hard. "I can't promise an easy life. This desert doesn't forgive, and we both carry scars that won't fade. But I promise to ride beside you through whatever comes, to speak when silence would be easier, to stay when leaving would be safer. You're my home now. Grace, the first I've known in 12 years. Grace's eyes shimmered with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Thomas McKinley. I came west running from a life that tried to make me small. I found dust and hardship, prejudice and danger. But I also found you a man who sees me not as what others say I am, but as who I choose to be." She lifted their joined hands slightly. "You gave me protection without taking my freedom. You offered partnership without demanding submission. In your quiet strength, I found permission to be strong too. I promise to sing through our storms, to teach hope to our children should we be blessed with them, and to help you remember that the past may shape us, but needn't define us. You're not just my husband. Thomas, you're my sanctuary." Father Miguel's blessing washed over them in Latin and English, but the church erupted before he could finish. Cheers, applause, and a few rebel yells from the miners filled the small space. Thomas looked at Grace, then spoke the words he'd carried silently for so long. "I've been riding alone for 12 winters." He paused, voice thick with emotion. "The Cowboy said," then kissed the bride and took her home. The kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, as if they both feared this happiness might shatter at too firm a touch. But the congregation's joy was anything but restrained. Rice, precious in the desert, flew through the air, and the church bells rang with enthusiasm that made up for their tinny tone. They didn't leave in a fancy carriage, but on faithful cinder, Thomas's old mare decorated with ribbons by the local children. Grace sat sideways in her wedding dress, arms around Thomas's waist, as they rode through Main Street. The whole town had turned out, even those who'd once scorned Grace's profession. They threw flower petals saved from the funeral wreaths, transforming symbols of death into celebration of new life. The house on Cottonwood Street was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it sat in the shade of old cottonwood trees, luxury in the desert. Someone had hung a horseshoe over the door for luck, and Rose's Cafe had provided a wedding feast spread on boards across sawhorses in the yard. As afternoon faded to evening, the party moved indoors. Grace placed her few belongings on the shelf her Shakespeare and Whitman, now joined by a Bible father Miguel had gifted them. Thomas hung his sheriff's star on a peg, saying quietly, "Justice is everyone's responsibility, not just one man's burden." "And teaching?" Grace asked. "Will you help me with the older boys? They need to see men who value learning." "Every day you'll have me," he promised. "We'll build something new here, together." The rain came at sunset, not the violent thunderstorms that brought flash floods, but a gentle, soaking rain that smelled of creosote and promise. They stood on their small porch, watching the desert drink deeply. "Do you regret it?" Grace asked. "The solitude, the freedom to leave whenever you wanted." Thomas pulled her closer. "I wasn't free. I was running. Same as you." He gestured at the rain-softened landscape. "This is freedom, choosing to stay, choosing to build, choosing to trust another person with your whole heart." They went inside as darkness fell, leaving the door open to the sound of rain. On the table, Grace had already started tomorrow's lesson plan. Thomas's deputy badge lay beside it, both ready to serve their community come morning. Through the night, rain drummed on the roof, washing the dust from Red Butte's streets. By dawn, the desert bloomed with sudden flowers, gold poppies, purple lupines, white evening primroses. The town woke to color it hadn't seen in months. Grace stood at the schoolhouse door, watching children arrive for lessons. Their voices carried across the morning air, no longer subdued by fear or hunger. Thomas passed on his morning rounds, touching his hat brim to his wife, and she felt the solid reality of their new life settle around her like a comfortable shawl. She wrote the day's lesson on the board: freedom, kindness, justice. 3 words that would guide every lesson, every day, for all the years to come. The bell rang, children settled on their benches, and Grace began, "Today, we learn about the power of words to change the world." Outside, Thomas continued his patrol, nodding to merchants opening their shops, checking on the mine's new safety protocols. The star on his chest caught the morning light, but it was just metal. The real protection came from a community that had learned to stand together. Red Butte still faced challenges. The desert remained unforgiving. The mine owners would try again to exploit the workers, and prejudice died hard. But something fundamental had shifted. In choosing to fight for each other, the people had discovered their own strength, and in choosing to stay and build rather than run and hide, Thomas and Grace had found not just love, but purpose. The Wild West was still wild, but in small pockets like Red Butte, civilization bloomed like desert flowers after rain, fragile, precious, and absolutely determined to survive. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what touched your heart in Thomas and Grace's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit that like button. And don't forget to click the hype button to help more people discover these authentic frontier tales of love, courage, and redemption. Until next time, partners.